Good morning. My name is Daphina Misiedjan. I'm an assistant professor at the International Institute of Social Studies, which is part of Erasmus University. Unfortunately, I'm not able to join you this morning, but I'm happy to be able to share with you some of my thoughts on the right to nature, not only for humans, but also or the right to water, not only for humans, but also for nature. So let's get started. I would first like to ask you whether or not you know where this is. Do you think that this is a film set? Do you think that this is an actual place? This place is actually located in South Africa, in Cape Town. And this is around the time that Cape Town was experiencing day zero. So for a couple of weeks, Cape Town was experiencing a lot of drought. This was a couple of years back. And it was said to be the first big city to experience day zero. Day zero meaning that the city and its surroundings would be without water, that there would be no water coming from the taps. And Cape Town, even though it was one of the first cities to experience that, would not be the last one. We will see that in the future, more cities will experience day zeros. Also in places such as Spain, Morocco, India, Iraq, to name a few. But also in Mexico, we are more and more seeing this, and it's just also in Brazil. So access to water can become, or is going to become, an issue within the very near future. And for some communities, is already an issue today. So when I talk about the human right to water, I think it's very important to center the communities that are indeed very much concerned with it and have been fighting for its access. Now, what is interesting about the human right to water is that it hasn't been recognized as a human right for too long. Actually, it only started becoming a right around the 2000s. And one of the central moments for that was this moment. Again, where do you think this could be? You see a lot of Spanish. You see some traditional clothing that we know from the Andes area. So that could lead you to the conclusion that this is probably Bolivia. And this is indeed Bolivia around the 2000s, the end of the 1990s, when the Cochabamba water wars took place. Now, this was a moment in time when water was privatized, and it led to the price of water increasing by 100+%. It was around 120%, which meant that certain people were unable to pay for their water, also farmers. Now, this led to people going out in the street, protesting for their access to water. And there were clashes with the police, resulting in the death of several people. Now, this is a pivotal moment, not only for Bolivia, but also actually for the rest of the world, because one of the central players in this situation was also Evo Morales, who at that point was part of the local politics. He later became the president of Bolivia and argued in favor of the human right to water at the international level. So he was one of the people who really tried to push for establishing water or access to water as a human right. Now, this human right to water is a very interesting right, because what we can see is that it's not explicitly mentioned in the catalog of human rights that we have. We have the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, but none of these mention the human right to water. They talk about the right to food, for instance, also the right to an adequate standard of health, but water is not explicitly mentioned there. So there needed to be a new statement, a new mentioning of what the human right to water could entail. And that statement came out in 2002. And here we see that the human right to water is mentioned as entitling everyone to sufficient, safe, acceptable, and physically accessible water, and affordable water for personal and domestic uses. So this is what the UN actually sees as human right to water meaning. And they came to this conclusion after also looking at Article 11 of the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Convention and Article 12 of that same convention, which mention the right to adequate standard of living and the right to health. And he said, if we can look at these two articles, what they mention, then we can say that the human right to water should talk about it being sufficient, safe, acceptable, physically accessible, and affordable for personal and domestic uses. Now, this human right to water, as they have formulated it, means that states have obligations. The state has the obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill your human right to water, meaning that it should not interfere with your access to water. For instance, if you already have access to water in your house, then there shouldn't be this arbitrary ways of disconnecting you. That would fall under the respect provision. The state also needs to protect your right to water, which means that no third party should interfere with your access. That is, for instance, could be the case when another third party is polluting your the wells that you use. And lastly, you have the obligation to fulfill, which means that the state needs to use its resources, its financial resources, but also its natural resources to realize your access to water. So let's zoom in on the right and see what it means in practice a little bit more. So sufficient means that you should have access to between 50 to 100 liters. And what we see in the Netherlands, for instance, is that most people use between 100 to 120 liters per day. But this only concerns the direct use of water. So the water that we use to, for instance, drink or to wash per person per day. It doesn't talk about the indirect use that we have. For instance, the clothes that we wear have been produced using water. The food that we eat, the water, or the water that is used to, for instance, make sure that there is meat production. That is all not taken into account when we look at this 120 liters. So it is very interesting to see that that is sort of disregarded or not taken into account when we look at our water footprint. So sometimes, or oftentimes, especially for communities and people living in the global south or in the global north, we use a lot more water than we are entitled to. And we often don't know how much water we are actually using because it is not taken into account. So now let's look to the second obligation, or the second requirement, is that water should be safe. Now, that means that it should be free from any harmful substances, but it should also be acceptable in color, taste, and smell. Now, here we can see that also in the case of the Netherlands, there are some examples where there are issues around water safety. For instance, for communities who live in social housing, especially in Amsterdam, there are certain houses, social housing, of which we know that there is too much lead in the water. This last year, that has been especially brought to the forefront, and they are trying to now also make sure that the lead piping of those houses is being taken care of to make sure that water is safe for communities to drink. And then we also have accessible, which means that we should be able to access water within 1,000 meters or half an hour of walking. What is nice to see is that around the Netherlands, more and more Public free water points are becoming available, which are especially relevant in times of heat, when we often have vulnerable communities, vulnerable people who are susceptible to the heat. But through these points, through these access points, can make sure that they have enough water to drink to maintain their health. And affordable is also a requirement, which means that water should not necessarily be free. When I talk to people, they often argue, of course, from a moral standpoint, that access to water should be free. But because water also, or access to water also comes with, or comes through some services, it is okay for it to actually cost something. But it should be affordable, meaning that it should only amount to a maximum of 3% of the household income. Now, here also within the context of the Netherlands, we see some challenges with people who might not be able to afford for their water bill. And of course, that will probably increase now that we're having also this energy crisis that we're dealing with. But even before that time, we saw that also families with children were being disconnected from access to water when they were unable to pay the bill. There has been a case at the Dutch court, but in that case, the court actually said that it was allowed for families to be disconnected because their parents are actually the ones responsible for paying the bills. And there's some kind of warning system also connected to them being disconnected. Now, of course, you could argue against that, but this is the current situation in the Netherlands where it is allowed. If we look at it from the international perspective, from the UN, there is a lot of advisory. There are a lot of advisory opinions on this, saying that financial issues should not be reasons for disconnection. What should be in place are some kind of subsidies or other instruments that communities can use if they are unable to pay their bills. So, lastly, the last requirement for the human right to water, or what the human right to water entails, is that it covers access to water for personal and domestic uses. So this is drinking, washing, preparation of food, and personal hygiene. But it doesn't include, for instance, agriculture. Now, agriculture is more part of, for instance, the right to food. What is also interesting is that ecosystems are not included. And that brings us to the next point, which is the right to water for nature. Now, what we see the last couple of years is that access to water, or actually rights in general, do not only cover access for humans, but also access for nature. Now, we see that natural phenomena such as rivers or forests or mountains are becoming more and more recognized within the legal sphere. And they are recognized in such a way that, for instance, their right to be restored or the right to be respected are now included in certain constitutions around the world, or in other laws, or in court cases. Now, this perspective of granting or recognizing rights of nature is actually mostly rooted in indigenous cosmologies, where rivers and forests and mountains are often seen as kin, as family, as having some kind of personality as well. And now that perspective is being included in different constitutions and different laws around the world as a way to kind of deal with the failure of the conventional environmental laws that we've seen so far. And it often includes some elements which are similar to the human rights framework. So rights of nature also takes away nature being just merely human property. It gives rights to nature, which can also be enforced in court. And it creates also human duties, such as guardianships or stewardships or committees that help realize rights of nature. Now, the first example of this we see in the 2008 Constitution of Ecuador, which includes a whole chapter on rights of nature, also the right to be respected, to be restored, and the human responsibilities that are connected to that. Now here you see a map which is actually already updated. You see the example of the rivers within India, but also in Uganda. We see an example in Bolivia and Ecuador, also Colombia and Mexico and the US. But these days there are even more examples of rights of nature laws or court cases. Now, rights of nature can come about, like I said, through different ways. They can come about through legislation, so adapting a new law which talks about rights of nature. It can also come through courts, so courts can assign or recognize rights of nature in their court cases. And lastly, we also have other examples, such as, for instance, the referenda or other local forms of recognition of rights of nature. Now we see that there, like around the world, there are different things happening. There's a lot of strategic litigation also going on in relation to rights of nature. But one of the central examples is the Whanganui River in New Zealand, where a law was entered into force in 2017, which recognized the rights of the Whanganui River. Now, this is the result of centuries of resistance from the Maori community connected to the Whanganui River, which actually brought this about. So again, I want to kind of highlight the marginalized communities that have been very central to bringing about these different movements and these different changes around the world. Now, what is mentioned in this law is that the river is recognized as an indivisible and living whole, not only the physical parts, but also the metaphysical elements of it. So the spiritual value that the Maori community, for instance, gives to the river. 2 guardians have been assigned over the river, one on behalf of the community, the Maori community, and the other one on behalf of the government. They are supported by an advisory board, which then helps them to see how rights of nature, what they mean for this river. What does the quality of water need to be? What type of animals should be supported in living in the river? Those type of things are discussed within this advisory board to support the guardians. Now, the Maori community has been receptive to their worldview being included in the laws. And when the law went into force, they were also given the opportunity to express that through their traditional ways of expression. Now, what is interesting is that also in the Netherlands, there are some different initiatives around recognizing rights of nature. For instance, in the case of Amelisweert, the forest or the trees that are there, and the highway that is meant to be built, there has been an initiative to protect the Amelisweert by recognizing the rights of the trees there. And you also have the Embassy of the North Sea, which tries to represent the North Sea and tries to listen to the North Sea. And lastly, also for the Maas and actually the Waddenzee, there have been initiatives to recognize their rights and to see what that could look like in the Dutch context. So these are all examples of kind of the stretching of what law could mean, right? We started off talking about the human right to water and how that firstly wasn't recognized in the law, but also through different events concerning, in this case, Bolivia. The issue of access to water was actually brought to the international stage. Then we also looked at what the human right to water means in the context of the Netherlands and what are some of the challenges even in this context, for instance, in relation to whether or not water is always safe, and who for whom water is still affordable. And after that, we looked at indeed this rights of nature movement, which I think can be very interesting to look at also, to see if it can help us in the fight against climate change. Well, I'm very happy that I was able to contribute this to the discussion, and I look forward to hearing how the further discussion went. And I wish you a good day and a successful meeting. Thank you very much, and I look forward to staying in touch.